Welcome to this very special 5x15 event with the wonderful Paul Auster, one of the world's most exciting, original and revered authors. And it's our huge honor to be hosting him here this evening at 5x15 online. So whether you're watching live now on the webinar or on catch up or on our podcast, thank you for being with us. And let me introduce, first of all, this evening, our chair, Alex Preston. He's a prize-winning author of 4 novels, including the forthcoming Winchelsea and several books of nonfiction. And he writes and reviews for The Observer, The Telegraph, The New York Times, and many others. And it's a thrill to have him with us. So Paul Auster's new incredible book is Burning Boy, The Life and Work of Stephen Crane. And it's out now, so please do remember to pick up a copy. And I know that Newham Books will be delighted to help you. And Stephanie's going to post the details in the chat. Please put your all-important questions for Paul in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screens. And I know Alex is going to try to come to as many as he can towards the end of this hour-long session. But for now, I will disappear into the virtual wings and say a huge welcome to Paul and to Alex. And thank you both for being with us. And over to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Really, really lovely to be here. And Paul, so good to see you again. And where are you?
I'm sitting in Siri's study on the top floor of our house in Brooklyn. So I've been doing a world tour without leaving this seat in my own neck of the woods.
Fantastic. Well, it's lovely to see you. So I sort of presume that everyone knows Paul Auster and the brilliance of his work, but just to give a quick summary, the author of 14 novels, 10 works of nonfiction, 4 screenplays, and a book of poetry, winner of numerous awards. To my mind, Paul, I think you are perhaps the greatest living writer, or certainly, you're my greatest living writer, and I think you're the writer I return to most. And what is astonishing about this new book is that I started reading it thinking it was one thing, and I finished reading it knowing that it was something else quite entirely. I wonder if we could maybe just hear a little bit about from the book, if you'd like to read us a little bit, that really I think introduces people to the to the book and to its hero, Stephen Crane.
Yes, I thought it might be helpful to do this because I think my written descriptions are better than anything I could say today. And I understand, and I know full well that most people listening in today have never read anything by Stephen Crane and might know nothing about him at all. So here's the first paragraph of the book. Born on the Day of the Dead and dead 5 months before his 29th birthday, Stephen Crane lived 5 months and 5 days into the 20th century, undone by tuberculosis before he had a chance to drive an automobile or see an airplane, to watch a film projected on a large screen or listen to a radio, a figure from the horse and buggy world who missed out on the future that was awaiting his peers. Not just the construction of those miraculous machines and inventions, but the horrors of the age as well, including the destruction of tens of millions of lives in 2 world wars. His contemporaries were Henri Matisse, 22 months older than he was, Vladimir Lenin, 17 months older, Marcel Proust, 4 months older, and such American writers as W.E.B. Du Bois, Theodore Dreiser, Willa Cather, Gertrude Stein, Sherwood Anderson, and Robert Frost, all of whom carried on well into the new century. But Crane's work, which shunned the traditions of nearly everything that had come before him, was so radical for its time that he can be regarded now as the first American modernist, the man most responsible for changing the way we see the world through the lens of the written word. Now, after some passages about his family, his father died when Crane was 8. I jump to this. After one disaffected and aborted year as a college student, a single semester at Lafayette, followed by another semester at Syracuse, where he played on the baseball team and registered for just one course. Crane headed back to the twin destinations of Asbury Park and New York City, determined to make his way as a professional writer. He was not yet 20 years old. On September 28th, just blocks away from where Crane would soon be living in Manhattan, the unread and all but forgotten Herman Melville died. On November 10th, thousands of miles to the east in Marseille, France, Arthur Rimbaud died at the age of 37. 27 days after that, Crane's 64-year-old mother died of cancer. The newly orphaned budding writer had only 8.5 more years to live himself. But in that short time, he produced one masterpiece of a novel, The Red Badge of Courage, two boldly imagined and exquisite novellas, Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, and The Monster. Close to 36 stories of unimpeachable brilliance, among them The Open Boat and The Blue Hotel, two collections of some of the strangest, most savage poems of the 19th century, The Black Riders and War is Kind, and more than 200 pieces of journalism, many of them so good that they stand on equal footing with his literary work. A burning boy of rare precociousness who was blocked from entering the fullness of adulthood, he is America's answer to Keats and Shelley, to Schubert and Mozart. And if he continues to live on as they do, it is because his work has never grown old. 120 years after his death, Stephen Crane continues to burn. Well, then I go on to say that in spite of all that, people are not paying a lot of attention to Crane these days. And I'll pick up here. If it had been otherwise, I never would have thought of writing this book. I come to it not as a specialist or a scholar, but as an old writer in awe of a young writer's genius. Having spent the past 2 years poring over every one of Crane's works, having read through every one of his published letters, having snatched up every piece of biographical information I could put my hands on, I find myself just as fascinated by Crane's frantic, contradictory life as by the work he left us. It was a weird and singular life, full of impulsive risks, and often pulverizing lack of money, and a pig-headed, intractable devotion to his calling as a writer, which flung him from one unlikely and perilous situation to the next. A controversial article written at 20 that disrupted the course of the 1892 presidential campaign. A public battle with the New York Police Department that effectively exiled him from the city in 1896. A shipwreck off the coast of Florida that led to his near drowning in 1897. A common law marriage to the proprietress of Jacksonville's most elegant bawdy house, the Hotel de Dream. Work as a correspondent during the Spanish-American War in Cuba, where he repeatedly stood in the line of enemy fire. And then his final years in England, where Joseph Conrad was his closest friend, and Henry James wept over his early death. And this writer, who is best known as a chronicler of war, embraced many other subjects as well, handling them all with immense skill and originality, from stories about young children and struggling bohemian artists to firsthand accounts of New York opium dens, conditions in the Pennsylvania coal mine, and a devastating drought in Nebraska. And much like Edgar Allan Poe, often mistakenly identified as nothing more than our dark-browed purveyor of horror and mystery, when in fact he was a master humorist as well, the somber, pessimistic Crane could be hilariously funny when he chose to be. And underneath the mountain of his prose, or perhaps on top of it, there are his poems, which few people in or out of the academy have ever known quite what to do with. Poems so far from the traditional norms of 19th century verse making, including the norm-breaking deviations of Whitman and Dickinson, that they scarcely seem to count as poetry at all. And yet, they stay in the mind more persistently than most other American poems I can think of. as for example, this one, which has continued to haunt me ever since I first read it more than 5 decades ago. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who, squatting upon the ground, held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter, bitter," he answered. "But I like it because it is bitter and because it is my heart." A remarkable poem. Yes.
That's an incredible poem. I mean, what do you do with that? So, Paul, in some ways, why you wrote this book is obvious. It's because Crane is brilliant and he ought to be absolutely at the pinnacle of American letters. And it's extraordinary to me, who had always thought of him as somebody who was incredibly well known and loved in America, but just hadn't made it across the Atlantic, that he is sort of that he is becoming something of a kind of niche interest in America as well. But I guess, other than the fact that you were both born in Newark, why did you choose to write about Stephen Crane now?
Well, I think the fact of Newark has nothing to do with why
Okay.
I got interested in Crane, nor the fact that I too, like Crane, loved playing baseball when I was young, et cetera, et cetera. No, what happened was this: even though I did read Crane when I was young in high school, because back in those days, every young student of 15, 16 across America was required to read the Red Badge of Courage in English class. But this is no longer the case. Um, but in any case, I went years, decades without going back to Crane. I think there's some misapprehension that some reviews I've seen have said, he's been a great passion of mine for 60 years. Well, it's not true. I kind of forgot about Stephen Crane myself. After I finished my long novel, 4321, this was in 2016 when I finished writing it. I was exhausted, absolutely burned out, and I knew I needed to take a break. For the first time, I just said to myself, no writing for the foreseeable future. And so I spent the next months reading a lot, looking at movies. And one of the things I started reading was Crane. I saw my Viking portable edition of Crane on the shelf, and I said, it's been so many years, I should take another look. And I opened this 500-page selection of his work to The Monster, which is a 60-page novella. And I was so flattened by it. I was so impressed. I never had even heard of The Monster, let alone read it. And it inspired me to just then gobble up everything in that collection, then buy a bigger collection published by the Library of America, which is about 1,300 pages. And I read every single piece in there, whether novel, story, poem, journalism, and then graduated to the collected works of Stephen Crane, 10 volumes. And I understood that I had made one of the great literary discoveries of my life at a late point in my life. And I became so interested in this that I started digging into the business of his biography and so on, and realized that I wanted to write a book about Crane. I thought it would be about 150 or 200 pages, just a small, compact.
It's not. I would like to show the
I
audience.
I know. My um, anticipation of a small book turned out not to work out, because I realized too that the reason I wanted to write this was to get people to start reading him again. I feel that he's so important, and I feel that he's vital even now. The kinds of things he's writing about, they have not grown old. He's not an antiquated writer, because his greatest work is all about essential questions, and these are all eternal. He writes about poverty. He writes about war. He writes about danger. In other words, people in extreme situations, which is something that never changes. And so that was my motive, just to get people to read him. But I thought I can't just tell the story of his life. The life means nothing, even though it's very, very interesting, and is quite a amazing story in itself. What really counts for me is the work he produced. And so half the book is close readings of many of his works, and I kind of alternate between the biographical parts and the reading parts.
Yeah, and I mean, there's that famous quote by Walter Benjamin about Proust, that great books found their own genre. I mean, it does feel like this is not a type of book that I have read before, because it seems to be doing so many different things. But the thing that really strikes me about this close reading, and it goes back to something you've already said. You said that that Crane has fallen into the academy, or he has become something that people write, postgraduate theses about, but don't read at school anymore. And it feels like you are very keen for it not to be a kind of academic, literary, critical reading of him,
Not
but
at all.
rather much more to be an appreciation, and to be almost a kind of like a lesson in how to read like Paul Auster, or how to read like anyone who wants to get the absolute most from these extraordinary stories.
I imagine myself as a friend of the reader, saying, "Look at this. Look at that sentence. See how he puts it together. Let's think about this." I have a great dislike for academic literary criticism. It has always bored me, except for some rare instances. It just simply doesn't interest me, and I didn't want to approach it that way. So I'm writing it for someone who is unfamiliar with the work entirely. I'm trying to introduce all these different works in all these different forms, so that a reader will have some sense of what is in each one of these pieces and how they operate. Because Crane was a writer of varied approaches, and it all depends on what the subject was, the material that would determine the kind of prose he was writing. So he had not just one fixed way of expressing himself, but multiple ways. And I think it's interesting to explore all that.
And I guess his work can be broken down into those sort of three key areas. That you have the fiction, which is the one novel, and then these shorter novels, novelettes, whatever you want to call them, and then really the extraordinary short stories. You have the poetry, which, I mean, you've already had the one example there, but it really is some of the strangest, darkest, most brilliant stuff I've read. But what I hadn't come across before was the journalism, and
Mhm.
you give some wonderful examples of it. But he was, maybe he would have thought of himself first, at least initially, as a journalist. And of course, his earliest writing was as often anonymous journalist, really kind of making his way in the world. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you approached each of those different forms in which he was operating?
Well, it's complicated, this whole business about journalism, because yes, the standard view of Crane is that yes, he was a reporter, and that this trained him to become a fiction writer. But you see, I disagree. He wasn't a reporter, and everyone who ever worked with him said he's not cut out for being a professional journalist. He's not disciplined enough, and he doesn't think the way a reporter thinks. He approached his subjects in the way a novelist thinks, or a short story writer thinks. And at the time, you see, it's important to say journalism, let's put quotes around the word, journalism functioned differently than it does today. And there was another category which most of Crane's so-called journalism fits into, is called the sketch. Now, the sketch is something that uses the techniques of fiction to write about something that is supposedly true. I have a feeling that so Crane, when he was young, in the early days of his career in New York, he worked for newspapers, in particular a now defunct paper called the New York Press, and he was writing things about every aspect of New York City life, from um, um, the impoverished living, because Crane was writing all this during the Panic of 1893, which was the greatest depression in American history up to that point. Unemployment in New York was something like 30%. It was a disastrous time. So he wrote about the impoverished, but he also wrote about the rich. He wrote a whole beautiful piece about the journey of a cable car during the day. What happens to the cable car?
It's an incredible piece because it is, firstly, it feels so modernist. It feels like a kind of piece of futurism or something, and yet it gets everything as well. It's not just style.
No. And he also, he writes about, an immigrant Italian who falls on this sidewalk with an epileptic fit. That's the whole story. And it's remarkable, I think. But I think you can't actually verify exactly the truth or or what's made up in these stories. And when Crane later was reporting, because I guess we can also say another type of journalism he did was war reporting, and he was present in two wars. A short 1-month war in Greece, which was fought with Turkey in 1897. And then the Spanish-American War in Cuba in 1898. All his colleagues said that Crane was hopeless, that he took so long to write his pieces because he was laboring over the prose. But the end result is, terrific pieces of writing that are far superior to what the normal dispatch would be. So even there, he was to the side. And as one of his schoolmates said, Crane, very irregular in his habits. And I think that was true all throughout. And he never could have held down a regular job as a newspaperman.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I read somewhere there is an unnaturally high number of writers who happen to have priests or preachers for fathers or parents, and he was brought up by a strict Methodist. His father obviously died when he was still quite young, but it was a family of Methodists, and his mother was also in the church or a believer, and yet he was drinking and smoking at the age of 6. This was a kid who was going to live fast, die young.
Well, it's true, and he rebelled against the religion of his parents. His mother was an active temperance speaker. She traveled all over the country, um, lecturing on the evils of drink, and he could never understand it. She was a very intelligent woman. She wrote lots of articles and was one of the first women to graduate from a university. But Crane broke away from it early, and he had a lot of contempt for it. But that doesn't mean he didn't love both his parents very much. He was connected to his family, and he
And it
admired
was a
his
huge
father.
family.
Yes, well, he was the youngest of 14 children. It's quite remarkable to think of that, 9 of whom survived. And he was so much younger than his next oldest sibling. There was an 8-year difference. So,
And
for
some of his
example,
siblings were twice his age, which is,
exactly. And when Crane was a teenager, one of his older brothers, Townley, was a journalist, and he ran a news agency and was connected to the New York Tribune uh, out of Asbury Park, New Jersey, which was a great resort town at the time. with a tremendous summer season. Hundreds of thousands of people were there. And that's where Crane did do his first writing, working as a kind of stringer for his brother's news agency. And he'd be writing about inconsequential things, the social events and so on, but always with tremendous wit. Even as a teenager, he had this biting irony to his take on the world, and it's fun to read these things now, even.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen of the audience, just a reminder that you can put your questions to Paul in the Q&A box at the bottom there. If you just click on it and type it in, we will see it. So the Red Badge of Courage is obviously, as we said, it's his best known book. Do you suggest that is the place that people start with him? Part of the issue, certainly in the UK, is simply access to the other work. I mean, there is actually quite a lot that is online of his journalism, so that's where I read some of it. His poetry I had to order from the States. But do you think that the Red Badge of Courage is a kind of representative way to get into Crane?
It is. I think yes. I came up with a list of 6 works that I think anyone who really wants to explore Crane should read, and they're all short. I don't think it would take more than 2 days to read all of them. So I would begin with his first novel, which is only about 80 pages. It's a novella, Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, a book so explosive that no publisher would touch it. And he used all the money from his inheritance of his mother's death to print it himself. And then and then the next novel he wrote, longer fiction, was The Red Badge of Courage, which is, I think, still generally acknowledged as the greatest war novel ever written by an American.
I mean, it's totally incredible, and it's like nothing else.
Let me say something about it, why it was so original. You see, Crane was radical because he stripped out everything that was not absolutely essential to his purpose. So he really got rid of all the 19th century novelistic conventions. Not that they weren't wonderful. I mean, we still take great pleasure in reading Dickens and Balzac and Tolstoy. They're wonderful writers, but Crane turned his back on that. So you have this war novel in which the name of the war is never mentioned. The reasons for the fighting are never mentioned. The
protagonist's name is almost never mentioned.
Well, he's called the Youth.
The Youth, exactly.
The Youth, and you only know his name by what his fellow soldiers call him, Henry Fleming, and Abraham Lincoln's name never comes up. No general's name ever comes up, and occasionally he'll talk about the blue or gray uniforms of the warring armies, but that's about it. And so what war novels usually will talk about the cause of the war, what's going on, and the home front, and there's always a love story somewhere in this, but none of that. It's only the war, and it's only the war as seen through the eyes of the protagonist, Henry, who is about 16 or 17 years old. And again, we don't even know exactly how old he is. Crane never tells us. And I think it's remarkable, you see, that it's a whole new approach. And H.G. Wells, who was a great friend of Crane's and loved his work, and at one point called him the greatest writer in English of the past 50 years, in one of Wells's novels, he said this, but he wrote an excellent essay on Crane's work right after Crane died in 1900. And he said, it's the opening of a new sensibility. And this work of Crane's is the product of immense renunciations, which I find so beautiful, because that's it, this stripping away of all convention. So moving on, those two, Maggie, The Red Badge of Courage, and then the other novella, 60 pages, The Monster, which is a remarkable story about race and I suppose social conflict in a small town. It's brilliant and truly astonishing. And then there are two 30-page stories each, which are, I mentioned in those early pages, The Open Boat, which is a kind of, I call it a, what did I call it exactly? Um, documentary fable,
Mm.
because it is based on true events. After the shipwreck, Crane was on a ship making its way to Cuba, where he was going to report on the early days of the Spanish and Cuban conflict. The boat sank. 7 out of the 20 people on board drowned. Crane wound up in a 10-foot rowboat, a dinghy, with the captain and 2 other crew members, and they couldn't get ashore. The sea was very, very rough. It was early January, and even in Florida, where they were, it was so difficult that they were out on the open sea for 30 hours, all through a night and 2 days. And one of the men in the boat died as it was reaching the shore when the boat hit him. Um, this was a seminal experience in Crane's life, and I think it's one of the most powerful American stories ever. And then there's another one called The Blue Hotel,
Mm.
which is the product of Crane's journey out west and to Mexico, where he was reporting. He was sending in articles about his travels. It was his dream job. He had never traveled anywhere until then. And that is set in Nebraska during a blizzard, and it's a real existential story. I mean, it's so far ahead of the moment in which it was written. And finally, just as a kind of turn into how good a comic writer he is, there's a 12-page story, The Bride Comes to Yellow Sky, which is also set out in the West, which is hilarious and profound at the same time. And I think, if someone also would want to, look at the poetry as well, I think you have a good grasp of what Crane did and how he went about doing it. And then you can make the deep dive into all kinds of other works. It's vast.
Yeah, yeah. Just coming back to that thing that H.G. Wells said, and by the way, I love it. I hope someday somebody will praise me for my renunciations. But you know, there, and you have described Crane as one of the first modernists, but you also say in the book that he was as influenced by his visits to galleries as he was by what he read, and he is such a visual writer. But I just reread The Red Badge of Courage and was sort of struck again by his use of color. And you actually say in the book that he was a synesthete, so he was somebody who actually was, like Kandinsky, was able to kind of identify colors with words and with feelings, and that there was colors for him represented something more than just sort of shades on a piece of canvas.
Absolutely. And I think we can verify the fact that he did have synesthesia because one of his closest friends was with him one day, and the friend later wrote about this. And they were walking along, I think, the waterfront, either in Manhattan or Brooklyn, and 2 boats almost collided. And one of the boatmen yelled out something, and Crane turned to his friend Hawkins, and he said, "What a green voice he has." And Hawkins said, "What, are you trying to be poetic? I mean, what does that mean?" And Crane said, "No, not at all. No, you don't hear it, that it's green." And no, of course, very few people have this syndrome, but apparently Nabokov had it. Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, had it. I think Duke Ellington had it.
Oh, interesting.
It's something rare, and but people from all different fields have I wouldn't say have suffered from it, just have it. I think it's probably a gift in some way.
Yes, I think that's probably true. Um, it seems Crane is an incredibly likable figure, and everyone likes him around him, and he seemed to have a kind of gift for friendship. And as you say, at the end of his life, he was in England, and he was friends with Conrad, and he was friends with H.G. Wells, and but you don't turn away while presenting what an attractive figure he was. You don't turn away from some of the things that were less attractive about him. And I thought the way you handled, you know, what were probably just the views of his time, was kind of, it was done sensitively, but without any attempt to kind of whitewash things. There's
No,
one particular early story called, or early sketch called Greed Rampant, that is really powerfully anti-Semitic. And I think there's a sort of temptation with these things to say, well, but this is also the same guy who wrote The Monster, which is, I think, a brilliant sort of, I guess, investigation of the very idea of skin color and of racial tension, and of the way that even an act of heroism can be relegated by people just because of the color of somebody's skin.
mhm.
But tell me, when you worked through that section, how did you approach it? Because I wonder where, I mean, this must have been around, you were writing this perhaps about the time of Black Lives Matter, and it must have been something that you felt was kind of really serious contemporary import.
Well, I remember I started writing the book in the fall of 2017.
Oh, okay, so a little
And I
earlier than.
finished it just before the pandemic lockdowns in February of last year, 2020. So in other words, it was pretty much the Trump administration.
Mm.
Not all of it, but a big chunk of it. And so yes, a lot was going on, and it was remarkable how today's America reminds me so much of the America of that period. But this piece, Greed Rampant, I mean, it was never published, and it was discovered, much later. And it's a repulsive piece of work. And I don't really understand why he did it, but he did write it. Uh, and yet, all the other evidence would suggest that Crane had nothing against the Jews at all. And there was a Jewish immigrant writer, a very famous figure back in the day, Abraham Kahan, who was the editor of the Jewish Daily Forward for, I think, 46 years. And he wrote many novels as well. Crane was so impressed by Kahan's first novel that he wanted to meet him, and they became friends. And Kahan admired Crane enormously and wrote about him in his memoirs. So it's kind of complicated.
But that's
Yeah.
very interesting to me that you were writing about it at a time when, you are famously, I mean, you were a kind of a major voice in the I guess, artistic resistance to Trump.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Crane certainly did do was to give a voice. I mean, there's a lovely passage where he's described as an author with compassion for everything that errs and suffers, which I thought was lovely.
Howells,
And
William Dean Howells wrote that about.
William Dean Howells wrote, who was also himself something of a racist, but we won't
Yeah,
go into that.
no.
But there is a lot in the book about the kind of social conditions. You've already mentioned that this was a time of the crash, but Crane was interested in giving a voice to those who didn't have a voice, in writing about people who were disenfranchised, about people who were poor and whose lives had gone off the rails. And I wonder whether writing it at a time when greed really was rampant, and when there was this sense that America had started this really terrible new chapter in its existence, whether that gave a certain sharpness to those passages of social commentary.
Well, it's quite possible. It's quite possible. Indeed, it is. I think that it's important to know. I mean, just to go back to what you were saying, Crane's likability and his ability to create friendships. He was someone who never bragged. He never trumpeted his own importance. He was modest, mostly quiet. Um, uh, Very few people, if any, ever heard him laugh. He smiled all the time. He had many different smiles for every different situation. He rubbed some people the wrong way. They just didn't like this little guy. He was 5'7" and he was about 125 pounds, very skinny. And they just felt that maybe the very quietness of this person um, made him somehow suspicious. So he didn't have everyone on his side, but the people who knew him understood that he was kind and generous, but he could also be thoughtless and quite cruel without intending to be. And his great flaw, the thing that really poisoned his last years, was his inability to hold on to money. He just let it
Although
slip.
in some ways that's the thing that I admired him for most. I just thought his complete single-minded devotion to a kind of rigorously puritanical writing life. I thought that was great. And the fact that he was very successful, he was the most successful author of his times for several years. He was selling unbelievable numbers of copies of his books, but he never had a penny.
No, well, only the Red Badge of Courage was a
Sure,
bestseller.
yeah.
And that was a big success. It was one of these international successes because it was probably even bigger in England than it was in the United States. But I do know that it came out in the fall of 1895. I think there were 2 more printings before the end of the year. And in 1896, there were 14 more printings in the United States. The problem with Crane's the money is that he didn't know anything when he signed the contract with the publisher, and he had a singularly terrible contract. And for example, there were no foreign rights, so he didn't see a penny from anything that sold in England, which is so deeply unfair and awful. But he didn't know any better, and he suffered because of it. And he kept entering into bizarre relationships with people like S.S. McClure, who established the first newspaper syndicate in the world. He reinvented newspapers, and Crane he did it twice, and it was very stupid to take advances from McClure, so he would have money to spend, and then pay back the money in stories, in work. But McClure didn't have to accept these things. And Crane often got stuck in these awful situations. And I know that he was a person who understood early on that he wasn't going to have a long life. And I understand that he was a person who loved taking risks. He didn't really feel fully alive unless he was risking something. The bourgeois life was not for him. He just as soon sleep outside on the hard ground than in a soft bed, maybe even preferred it. And he loved to gamble, and he played poker religiously. And he wasn't a particularly good poker player, but he liked the excitement of not knowing what was going to happen.
That's great.
Yeah. So
Listen, we've got quite a few questions from the audience, and I'd like to make sure we get through them all. So let me ask you the first one from Tom Woolston. Hi, Paul. Did you approach the book the same way you do a novel, or did you methodically plan it out?
That's a great question. I can say that I knew that there were certain things I wanted to cover, but I never planned anything out in very great detail. But this is the key thing. trying to come to grips with Crane as a human being, and to understand all his many contradictions, the erratic behavior that he could demonstrate, next to the very rock solid moral ground he stood on most of the time. I had to go through the same inner journey within myself as I do with characters in my novels, um, almost kind of trying to project myself into him. And I felt the more I wrote about Crane and the more I thought about him, the closer I became to him. I'm not sure I'm right about everything, but I feel that I do understand a lot now that I didn't understand when I started working on the project.
That's great. Here's a good one. So, and somebody's asked what was the title of the war novel. The war novel is The Red Badge of Courage. So here's Sam Dutton says, I read The Red Badge of Courage as a kid and I loved it, especially when I found out that the author had never been a Civil War soldier. Where does write what you know fit with Crane? And I think this is you've kind of an interesting question because he definitely tried. Yeah.
It's a great question because you see, on the one hand, Crane thought, he said, I think one succeeds in art, the nearest one comes to nature and the truth. And it's almost as if he's saying that if you write about what you know, precisely that, you're going to be able to write good things. But then again, there he is contradicting himself, writing about a war he never saw, a war that ended before he was even born. And so I think Crane, is finally, he's an imaginative writer in everything he did. And that's why even in the journalism, I'll give you an example. And it pertains to the Red Badge of Courage. When he was sent out west on this journalistic mission, to send in reports, the first thing he had to cover was this terrible drought in Nebraska. He arrived some months after. It was the dead of winter, and there were freezing temperatures and blizzards everywhere. And Crane had to write about and much of the state, a big chunk of it was destitute. They were starving because of the summer drought. All the crops had died. Crane writes the most vivid descriptions of what the drought did to the landscape in Nebraska, talking about the withered stalks of corn. I mean, it's very beautiful, descriptive writing, but he never saw it. He wasn't there. He was back east when the drought was taking place. No one ever questioned the accuracy of what he wrote. I'm sure he talked to people and said, what did the landscape look like? And they told him, and then he assimilated. But this was not firsthand knowledge. And yet it's so vivid, you can't imagine that he wasn't there. And this is why so many people read The Red Badge of Courage in the beginning, were convinced he had been in the war and that he was 22 and 23 years old when he wrote it. He was just a kid. And they assumed he was probably a 50-year-old veteran from the Civil War.
I love the fact that he initially he wanted to go to West Point and join the military and was dissuaded by his brother only because his brother persuaded him that there probably wouldn't be a war that he could fight in.
Right. How do you like that? Well,
yeah,
there were wars. He certainly covered them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this one from Martin Meteyard. Could Paul say something about The O'Ruddy, so Crane's final unfinished novel?
Oh, that's very interesting. Well, yes, Crane was writing this at the end of his life, and he had already had 3 very serious lung hemorrhages, and he wasn't well at all, and he was living in Sussex, and he was he again, it was mostly to make money. He wanted to write a novel that would bring in some cash. But he had been to Ireland and he had loved Ireland. He had written some beautiful pieces about his experiences there. And so he decided to write an 18th century picaresque about an Irishman, a Ruddy, who comes to England, I think, in pursuit of the woman he adores, and to rectify some point of honor. It's the first long fiction that Crane ever wrote in the first person, and it's very buoyant. It's full of life, and whether it's a great book or not, or would have been a great book if he had lived to finish it, I don't know. But it's certainly entertaining, and it shows that Crane was open to exploring new avenues. And it's a pity. He wrote about a little more than half of it, maybe 2/3 even, and then it was ultimately finished by another writer, and not published for another 3 or 4 years after Crane died, and nothing much happened with it. But it is certainly, worth reading. I think I certainly enjoyed it, but it's not up to the great works that Crane was capable of doing.
So there are two questions here which have a kind of particular interest for me, because I told you before we started that if I go to my top floor, I can actually see Breed House, Breed Place rather, where Stephen Crane lived while he was in Sussex. So one question is, why did Crane come to England? And another, am I right in thinking that Crane visited Henry James at Lamb House in Rye? I mean, I know the answer to that latter is definitely yes.
Yes.
But yeah, why did he end up here?
All right. Well, when there's so much that I haven't covered in this talk. One thing being this controversy he was in New York City.
Yeah, I mean
He defended
that's a novel in itself. His run-in with
exactly.
the New York police.
Well, which the commissioner of police was Theodore Roosevelt. Several years before he was made president, and Crane saw the false arrest of a prostitute by a plainclothes undercover policeman. He defended this woman in court, outraged the entire police department. I'm abridging the story. And they harassed him to such a degree that he understood he had to leave New York after living there for 5.5 years. He got a job with the Irving Bachelor, the same man who had sent him out west a few years earlier to cover the Cuban Revolution. And while in Jacksonville, waiting for the filibuster ship to take him there, he fell in love with Cora Taylor, a beautifully interesting woman. I mean, just as interesting a woman as Crane was a man at that period, a free-thinking, sexually independent woman who ran a kind of bawdy house. Anyway, she was very well read, very intelligent, and once Crane recovered and he understood he wasn't going to be able to get to Cuba, he decided to go to Greece to cover the war. He got Cora a job, and Cora, working under the name of Imogene Carter, became the first female war correspondent in American history, maybe in world history. And they decided in Greece, when they were there together, that they wanted to live together. She was married, had been divorced already once, but had a second husband, an Englishman, who refused to divorce her. They couldn't go back to America and live in sin, which would have been a terrible scandal for Crane's conservative religious family. So they decided to move to England instead, where people were much less nosy about people's private lives, and a lot of complex unions were in effect, outside of holy matrimony. And so they settled in England, and that's how they lived as Mr. and Mrs. Crane, and they stayed together until Crane's death. Henry James not only invited Crane to his house, he used to pedal over from Lamb House to visit the Cranes. He loved Crane. He thought Crane was the future of American writing. And Conrad, who I think became Crane's closest literary friend ever. And I think it was mutual. Conrad adored Crane, and then later on wrote with a photograph of Crane on his desk. He missed him so much after Crane died.
I have to say, I wish my tale of how I came to be in Sussex was as interesting as Crane's. So here's an interesting one, only because I think, well, I'm interested to hear how you answer it. What do you think he would have written if he'd lived?
It's a great question, and it can't be answered.
Exactly.
And I posed it in the book. I have a suspicion, given what he was doing in the last year of his life, that he would have veered towards first-person writing, which is a real change for Crane, who all through his early career was a strict third-person objective writer. And it was a philosophical position about a kind of neutrality about how to look at the world. But as he got a bit older, I think he relaxed a little bit. And I think he began to understand that by writing in the first person, it would be possible to, in a single work, combine all the different sides of his sensibility, from the darkest to the most ebullient. He was a rich character. And I think perhaps he would have written novels. I don't know if anyone knows the work of Louis Ferdinand Céline, Journey to the End of the Night and Death on the Installment Plan, these exuberant first-person narrations. Or maybe he would have been in a more austere mode, so maybe something like Beckett's Malloy. I don't know where it would have gone. It would have been different from both of those writers, but I think the first person was going to be the next door that Crane walked through if he had lived.
Interesting. But also, I guess that for me, somehow, the shortness of his life was what packed everything. There is something inescapable about the shortness of the life is there in the literature.
Yes, because the intensity of that shortness is there, and there's no question about it. Yeah. But,
so, sorry.
No, but a pity, why couldn't he have at least lived to 40, which is still very young, It's just so short. And that's why I think he didn't stick in the American canon, because he came and went so quickly. And he didn't write theoretical things about writing. He issued no aesthetic statements. He just worked, and he worked at all these different forms of writing, and then he vanished. And I don't even think anyone in his lifetime had any idea of all the things he was doing simultaneously. I don't think not even his best friends knew all the things he was doing.
Paul, I'm heartbroken to say we've come to the end of our allotted time. There are many more questions, including some very interesting ones, and a lovely appreciation by Sally Marie, who just wanted to tell you, no question, I just want to say how much I love your work. And
I thought
listen,
we were just warming up, Alex.
We were just, listen,
in my throat here.
Exactly. We'll have to pick it up again. But ladies and gentlemen, can I commend to you this wonderful book? It is not only a fascinating book about a wonderful writer, but it's like a lesson in writing and reading fearlessly. It's an extraordinary book, and I've now read it twice, and I will read it again shortly, because it is really a masterpiece. Paul, thank you very much. Daisy, I will hand over to you.
It just remains for me to say a huge thank you from us at 5 by 15. It's such an honor to have spent the last hour listening to this extraordinary, rich conversation, learning about Stephen Crane and celebrating Burning Boy, Paul Auster's new book. So thank you very, very much, Alex, for your excellent questions, and to our audience for your excellent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't come to all of them, but thank you all for being with us. And for this evening, that's all we have time for. But good night, and please do pick up a copy of Burning Boy from your local bookshop. Good night.